Hello, good day. My name is Naidoo, your moderator for today. Let us first start with some notes on the webinar and take stock of the following. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on their devices. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and the audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the question panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for the webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with attendees. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other. However, you are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this presentation will be made available on the Institute YouTube channel, SAIEE TV. The recording will also be made available on the Institute website. Past presentations can be viewed on our website under the Events drop-down menu in the section Past Events and Webinars. This page is updated regularly, so ensure you check back as often as possible for new uploads and subscribe to your YouTube channel for more updates. For those who are applying for Professional Engineer EXA CPD validation, we will post the details shortly as soon as we get the CPD numbers from EXA. Thank you and welcome to today's proceedings. The agenda for the day is as follows. We would have Mr. Nicholls present on the structure of the nuclear chapter of the Power and Energy Society. Thereafter, Professor Cornell will talk about the leadership, membership, and terms of reference for the study committees. And Mr. Nicholls will return to talk about the implications of the request for information for South Africa's 2,500 megawatt new nuclear procurement. Thereafter, we'll take questions and we will close. Thank you. On behalf of the President and members of Council, thank you for your attendance. The South African Institute of Electrical Engineers, established in 1909, continues to deliver 111 years of service excellence to our members and South Africa. Relevant to our webinar of today, let us also record the age of the Electricity Supply Commission of South Africa, the Safari Research Reactor at the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa, and that of the Koeberg Nuclear Power Station in the Cape. In 2023, world-class Eskom will celebrate 100 years. In 2025, Safari 1, which is one of 5 global producers of medical radioisotopes, will celebrate 60 years. In 2024, Koeberg will celebrate 40 years, with plans to go on for another 20 years. Given our strong foundation in nuclear and our renewed focus on creating and sustaining quality jobs and new employment for all, plus that of turbo boosting South Africa's economic renaissance for growth, development, and prosperity for all, we share with you the start of dedicated and voluntary workings at the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers Nuclear Chapter, which is one of 35 chapters of the Institute. Mrs. Ntombela, the chair of the Power and Energy section, will welcome you to the section and to the chapter.
Good day, everyone.
Mrs.
I'd like
Ntombela.
to welcome all attending members. I'm Engineer Ntombela, and I'm the SAIEE Power and Energy Section Chair. I'm excited to be part of the birth of the nuclear chapter. The chapter will help us to fulfill our mandate, which is promoting the electrical engineering field, influencing policies in electrical engineering field, promoting and advancing education and training in the electrical and the engineering field and associated sciences. Today, I'd like to take this opportunity to appreciate Mr. Nicholls and Prof. Cornell for taking up the challenge of leading the nuclear chapter. I'd like to express that I'm confident in your leadership. Thank you again for accepting this leadership role. I would now hand over to Prof. Naidoo, who will formally introduce Mr. Dave Nicholls. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nicholls was appointed as the chairperson of the board of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, NECSA, in January 2020 by the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. Internationally, Mr. Nicholls was the chairman of the IAEA Technical Working Group on Light Water Reactors from 2010 to 2016, and is currently the co-chair of the IAEA Technical Working Group on Nuclear Power Plant Operations. He was a member of Warner's post-Fukushima design review team from 2012 to 2018. Let me hand you over to Mr. Nicholls for his first presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Naidoo. I intend to do quite a short presentation, just explain the structure of the nuclear chapter of the PES in SAIEE. And this is just to explain what we're trying to do. And a key thing is looking at the study committees that we're forming to take this chapter forward. First of all, where does the nuclear chapter sit in the organization? There's the council, which has its technology, knowledge, and leadership committee. That committee has one of its sections as being the power and energy section, hence the PES. And the nuclear chapter is now underneath the power and energy sector, energy section. In terms of formation, just a bit of legality is that the SAIEE Council minutes of the 5th of July first discussed a nuclear chapter, and on the 1st of November it was formally approved to go forward. And it was actually launched at the General Conference, annual conference last year. So all I'm going to go to really is the 6 study committees that we are forming to actually do the work of this chapter. And as Simon will mention later, this is very much seen as a cross discipline approach. So we're not seeing it as a pure electrical activity, although it is sitting in the Electrical Institute. It is seen as a nuclear chapter for all engineering applications, and there is a view that we would like to, as the nuclear program in the country goes forward, create a separate voluntary association with this chapter as a basis. So we're going to have 6 study committees, and I'll go through them one by one as we go through them. Those are the titles there. Nuclear science, engineering, and technology is clearly the fundamentals of what we're doing, and that's research and development of nuclear phenomena and their applications, such as, and there's a list of potential areas. The ones that I'll sort of, besides the obvious one of physics and applied nuclear science, there's also the application of the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is really a function of how we apply big data and some of the modern manufacturing technologies coming from the 4th Industrial Revolution to the nuclear field, and so on. And material analysis, materials processing, uranium beneficiation and management, equipment inspection and qualification, and then regulation, health and safety. So this is probably the broadest of the ones we're putting up, but it's the catch-all and is the basis of nuclear science and engineering and technology. In the nuclear energy space, we're looking really at 3 almost different areas of wanting to support with the new chapter. The first is the continuity of supporting of Koeberg's 20-year life. It's run very effectively since 1984 through until 2024 is the end of its original nominal design life, 40 years. But as in line with the rest of the world, that's being extended up to 60 years. And that would require us to help as a society support that process, both in terms of development of people, but also applications of new technologies such as big data-driven asset management, and so on. The second one, and this will be discussed clearly in my second talk a bit later, is the application to the rollout of potentially more standard PWR plants, e.g. a 2,000 megawatt plus at Koeberg units 3 and 4, which we'll discuss a little bit later what the RFI is indicating or hinting at. And then we've got the next generation of machines in the nuclear field, advanced high temperature gas cooled reactors, sort of PWR type machines, and other small modular reactors with an aim to look at distributed generation. So the chapter is going to look very heavily at what is the new generation of nuclear going to look like in society, rather than being very large centralized facilities. Are we looking at town power stations, for example? And the future project prospects of fusion reactors that always intrigues me, because I'm a great believer that fusion is 20 years in the future, and maybe for the first time in 50 years, it is 20 years in the future. Then we've got nuclear medicine, a very important area. We're on a sort of study committee in this. And this is nuclear science in the field of medicine. And there's a number of areas here, and this very much is such as there's clearly the obvious starting point from a nuclear point of view is the creation of isotopes for medical applications, molybdenum-99, lutetium-177, iodine-131. Those are all isotopes being manufactured as we speak at Pelindaba. But more potentially to come. Nuclear imaging, diagnostic radiation medicine, which clearly involves the first two, for therapeutic nuclear medicine, and then research into biology, public health, and other things where nuclear can potentially help. Nuclear science can potentially help. So much is science-based, and we want to make sure this is taken. Environmental studies, clearly also very important in this field. So it's studying the impact and management of the environmental effects of nuclear radiation, waste management, including potentially reprocessing, whatever that might mean, impact of radiation on human health from both nuclear reactors and nuclear medicine. And then the impact on radiation on flora and fauna, which is clearly looking at the prospect of where does what are the non-Homo sapiens issues involved. And the next one is probably one of the most interesting ones. All the ones so far have been reasonably inside the nuclear family. This one is the one which is the reaching out to the rest of the industry, because under the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda of 2030, transforming our world, they're looking at strengthening the nexus of energy, water, waste, health, transport, all these things together. And so what we're looking at here is the application of nuclear science technology in non-direct energy applications, such with nuclear as a heat source. So these are people, and I'll give you a few examples, but there's quite many more. Water security, clearly the prospect of, if you need water in the Western Cape, could you desalinate the sea? And there's certainly the major project, for example, now going on in Egypt, which is going to be very large and do all that. Same thing up country on the Highveld. Can we use recovery of wastewater from the mining, for example? Energy is a key driver of that, and in a carbon constrained world, where does the energy come from? In transport, everyone talks about hydrogen economy. No one asks where the hydrogen comes from, and if you want to do high temperature hydrogen production actually in a low carbon way, then probably one of the obvious ways of doing it would be through high temperature nuclear plants. And then general energy intensive heating, cooling and smelting, that way forward. And then the waste beneficiation, and that is processing waste. So those are and then the last of the 6 study committees is education. And Simon will mention more of this a bit in his talk a bit later. But clearly we need to have an outreach into the education side, primarily aiming at, as I said earlier, at short learning programs and continuous professional development. And this is something we're just starting doing. One of our first activities is looking at short learning programs that tend to be university based classically, and CPD, which tends to be voluntary association, I think, to bring them together and make an SAIEE led activity of trying to develop those so people can get CPDs and use the CPD process as a way of getting academic qualifications as well. Clearly, undergraduate and postgraduate development from bachelor's all the way through to postdoctoral qualifications, and then cross-border globalization, internationalization, and learning of sharing experiences. particularly important as a very large number of African states are talking about some nuclear future. And we clearly have an obligation to support our neighboring states to the north of us in that development. And then lastly, my last slide is that, so this will be extended more by Simon. Constitutional leadership, we've got a chapter chair in the Secretariat. We were, so I'm not sure how it came about. I don't remember putting my name forward, but I ended up being made the chair, and I think the same thing with Simon and being secretary. So the next step is to establish and populate study committees, call for study committee leadership membership. Active drive for recruitment and registration, and then the first key activity we're seeing ourselves do is in the SLP and CPD activity, with the meetings being held quarterly going forward. I'm going to leave that to Simon to discuss more of that as we go. So that is a very brief rundown of the 6 committees, study committees that we see as being the backbone of the nuclear chapter as it gets started. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dave.
Okay.
All right. Colleagues, we'll take questions at the end of all the presentations. So let's go on to Professor Cornell's presentation. And Professor Cornell is going to talk about leadership, membership, and terms of reference for the study committees. Let me formally introduce Professor Cornell. He's our chapter secretariat. He's a fellow of the Institute of Electrical Engineers and also a fellow of the South African Institute of Physics. And he's our delegate to the CERN project in Switzerland. Professor Cornell is Professor of Physics at the University of Johannesburg. He has research interests in particle physics, nuclear physics, nuclear energy, material science, quantum physics, high performance computing, and applied innovative physics. His rating by the South African Research Funding Agency, NRF, cites him as having considerable international experience. So we welcome Professor Cornell, and we look forward to his presentation. And we'll do the same, we'll take questions at the end. So let me hand over to Professor Cornell.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'll be speaking on the leadership, membership, and terms of reference of the subcommittee. I want to start with mentioning some history. We had the inaugural conference, which was just a one-day parallel session at the occasion of the Institute's national conference in November last year. So here we established the vision and the mission, which you can read there, and also some objectives, which we are launching today. Developing firstly the chapter study committees and working groups, and these are the primary vehicles to progress the work of the nuclear chapter. We also want to broaden the umbrella that we are associated with at the moment. It's the SAIEE, but of course we fit within many other umbrellas and associations. And so we'd like to expand it, as you see on the slide as well there. Also, I want to mention the aspect of a voluntary association. There isn't really one for nuclear science, technology, and engineering sector at the moment. And we would like to grow this from the nuclear chapter via a roadmap. So how will we do this? We've got the chair and the secretariat, as mentioned, and now there's a call for study committee leadership and membership. This is actually going to be an inclusive, democratic, fully mandated process. I'll explain in a moment, but it will be done essentially electronically because of these COVID times. So there are our subcommittees, and we have filled in provisional chairs. They essentially act as champions, and they will lead the membership drive recruitment process, letting everyone know in more detail what is going on. And once they have membership and are up and running, holding meetings, they will then elect their officers. And so their officers will bootstrap themselves into being in that mandated process, which everyone can participate in. Finally, a word on the short learning programs. These are SLPs. So we are envisaging a process that allows people to train themselves not in a regular university program, but something very much more flexible, and also learning from the electronic delivery. But you could imagine an NQF 8 level and a SLP at 1/10 of that. And it would also be packaged and delivered in association with the SAIEE CPD program. So it would be jointly SLP CPD. And of course, people could accumulate sufficient SLPs for an entire degree. They could gain access to higher degree programs, research programs as well. Of course, there could be many other SLPs similar to this in this package. So we're in the process of designing all these training packages. We have something like 16 ready to go at the moment. Then we also have a very inclusive multi-university approach. So there will be partnerships between all stakeholders in this process. Students could register at any university, and there would be a proper way to accredit things. And we would also be able to involve partners in this training from industry or statutory bodies. So actually right now we're calling for content for this SLP program. So SLP CPD, if people have they should really come forwards, and then we will be able to fit it into the process. Then there will, in addition to the study committees, we're going to have the specialist committees. So these aren't worked out yet because we're busy with the launch. So basically they will be developed and be related to the broader nuclear chapter on the one hand, but on the other hand also we're going to embark on a roadmap to a voluntary association and then ultimately a professional body with all the accoutrements that go with that. And that will basically be a bridge between engineering and science. So that's all for now from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cornell. Let's bring on Mr. Nicholls again. And this time we'll bring on Mr. Nicholls, as Dave. Not in his official capacity, neither in his past capacity, just as Dave. Dave will talk to us about the factors influencing decisions on the proposed 2.5 gigawatt nuclear program for South Africa. Let me hand you to Dave.
Okay, I had to find the unmute button, so the first 30 seconds was lost. Okay, thank you, Pat. Yes, I want to emphasize this is a view of the RFI and what is logic behind it, clearly informed by some of my history of what's going on, but it should not be taken, except for the words I quoted from the RFI itself, to be an official anything. So what I want to do, first of all, is just when I discuss the background to the RFI, and I'm going to quote the RFI for doing that. What is the scope of the RFI? What's it really asked for? And also, in a sense, what is different in this RFI to the previous one that Eskom issued in 2016 that was stopped by a court case in 2017 as part of a wider discussion of the nuclear approach taken by the government at that point. Then I want to briefly discuss in background, why would we look at more nuclear on the South African system? What potential programs could come out of the RFI? So again, the RFI is only a request for information. It's not legally, but it's not commercially binding. It's merely asking for information from potential vendors. but clearly it is issued with the intent of getting to a point of a nuclear program. Possible timescales, and I'll come and then lastly, the economic impact of a nuclear program on the economy. Just to discuss that briefly and what one of the logic of doing this. So let's just go first of all to 4 extracts. So this is the only place I'm just quoting verbatim from the RFI. I thought it was worth quoting, well, I think of 4 of the key things that appear to be in the RFI. The first one is, and I won't read them word for word, but the first one says that in the 2019 IRP that was gazetted in October of last year, there was a very specific decision number 8, which is to commence preparations for a nuclear build program to the extent of 2,500 megawatts at the pace and scale the country can afford, because it's a no regret option in the long term. Now, I think what's also important, I mentioned again, if you don't, is that the IRP 2019 talked of a planning horizon of 2030. That is 10 years away. That essentially means that any large project that is not yet committed to, and I could put a large coal station, a large hydro station in Mozambique, for example, or a nuclear station, will not realistically be online before 2030. And therefore, as you pointed out, that this decision 8 is fully aligned to the current statements in the IRP, which is talking about what technologies are coming on stream between now and 2030. Then the next thing to mention is the Nuclear Energy Policy of 2008, which is gazetted in July 2008. It does emphasize our intention to pursue a pressurized water reactor power program and a nationally developed power bed modular reactor program. So there is, in the energy policy of 2008, there is a view that there should be 2 programs, one very much here and now, and one looking slightly farther in the future. The next one's important is that the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy intends to launch a nuclear new build power program in line with the approved IRP, and it explicitly looks at a base of baseload conventional PWRs and small modular reactors to a total of 2,500 meg at a pace and scale. Important to understand that this is therefore saying that the program is going to be launched by DMRE, but there is still no question, no obvious clarity of who's going to be the owner operator, and that's where the next step comes in. That the financing options and ownership models for such a high capital cost program is of great importance. Consideration be given to a complete range of such options in any future nuclear build program. So whereas the previous IRP, so the previous RFI ESCOM issued, was aimed at ESCOM being the owner operator, this RFI has opened the scope saying, propose of how we're going to do this, the way that can be funded and supported going forward. So it may well end up with a public-private partnership or PPAs or whatever else could be put into this process. So let's have a look at the actual scope. And there are 2 sections if you take out all the heading and footing, there's 2 basic sections. One talks about the RFI for the PWR plant. Now this is looking at, and so what it's asking for is we're asking for from the operator, from the supplier, what is your detailed experience with existing domestic and export PWR projects? In other words, don't send in a brochure. What have you actually done? What is your history of doing these things? So what is the real chance of something being on schedule or late? What is the schedule of being meeting time? What is the experience of lessons learned from previous nuclear construction programs? So clearly, as an experienced supplier of nuclear power plants, there are lessons that one's learned. What are those lessons, and how should we factor those into our way forward? The next one is interesting because it was not even mentioned in the 2016-17 RFI, is what are the desalination options with the nuclear power plant? And I'll come back later, but this actually clearly points at that both the 2 sites that are mentioned explicitly in the RFI, which is the Dana-Fontaine site, which is where Koeberg is, and the Tasman site, which is on the Eastern Cape, are water scarce areas. Now, clearly, when ESCOM issued the RFI back in 2016, it had no real interest in water. That wasn't part of ESCOM's mandate. In this case, it's slightly wider than that. And so the prospect is, what is the option for putting in a large desalination plant to go with the nuclear power plant? And that clearly might be of interest, particularly, should we say, in the Cape Town situation, because Cape Town almost ran out of water about 3 years ago. We're well aware of that. Secondly, is just as people understand the field of power plant construction, please discuss the difference between if we go for the brownfield site, that's Dana Fontaine, or if we go for the greenfield site, that's Statesman. What would that look like in terms of the cost issues involved? We've clearly asked for clearly the proposal is asking for at a pace and scale, and a pace would determine how much between the machines. So the question then is, what's the impact of time spacing in the construction of nuclear power plants? So if you build one machine every year, every 2 years, every 5 years, what does that do to the issues? And that clearly would aim at things like the need to mobilize and demobilize crews if the gap is too great. Let me come to 3 very important issues, or 2. One is financing solutions and related conditions. This is clearly, there is not a vast pile of money in South Africa sitting to pay for something. So how is the financing solution that you would propose, has worked in other areas, and what kind of conditions does that bring? What guarantees are required? What's that kind of thing? Then you've got localization, industrialization, IP, technology transfer, and skills model. That's clearly an important country, but not as important as in the previous RFI, where there was a lot of discussion of IP transfer and contracting approach. Is it your experience it's best to go for complete fixed price turnkey, a EPCM model? We're looking for what is the information that would help us decide what is the best way forward with that. So that's the PWR plant, and clearly aimed at looking at something. You've got a machine today. This would almost talk about a reference unit. In other words, we are buying South Africa, we're buying a machine getting a machine that is based on something somewhere else, exactly like Koeberg was based on Trickerstan. Now, that's for the PWR plant, but for the small modular reactor, it's a very different discussion. And I will comment that there was no mention in this RFI of a restarting of the PBMR project per se. It's looking at somebody else's design. So it's saying, and let's go through it therefore. So the first thing is it says, what's your experience in the SMR design and development to date, and what's the timeline to commercial deployment? So you've got a design that you're working on. You probably haven't built one yet because almost nobody has built an SMR yet. So what is the design? That's the second thing. But also, what's the timeline to commercial deployment? We would expect to be on site in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it's going to be. What are the estimates of ongoing resource requirements for the SMR design and deployment? So quite bluntly, whereas in the previous, in the PWR one, the question is, we've got a machine on a certain site in the world. We're going to offer you that design built in your country. Therefore, the design has been done. There'll be certainly some changes to meet South African regulations and some site specific, but essentially it'll be the same machine. There is no design and development work in this sense, but clearly an SMR, if no one's actually built it yet, the question is, how far is your design work gone? Have you got construction design? Have you got system design level, or what it is? Possible funding models for the whole project going forward. And then the obvious one of estimates of capital operating costs, both initial and serial construction, and the same for construction schedule. So what is your belief on going forward? Given that this is a new projection, what is the local content potential for both initial and serial construction, including possibly fuel manufacturing? Because clearly virtually all the SMRs on the table now are looking at some fuel form that is not currently a standard fuel form in the industry. The next 2 are quite important in terms of the prospect of going forward, and that is, to what extent does this technology, whatever your technology is as an SMR company, relate to South Africa's previous experience in SMR development, namely the PBMR? South Africa put a lot of money into developing the pebble bed modular reactor. It can almost be argued is one of the very first credible SMRs that was put on the table. And I remember when we were doing that 20 years ago, people said that 100, 120 megawatt machines were not commercial machines. They couldn't be commercial machines. That was not how. Anything less than 600 was meaningless. So it's very much, South Africa's got a lot of people, a lot of expertise, a lot of people, a lot of knowledge in the country about that. So we'd just like to see how close is what you're proposing relate to that. And then lastly, and probably one of the more important ones, is what is the willingness to support or collaborate in PWR design development? In other words, this is not a question of taking a machine off the shelf, which is the first one, and doing just building your design here. Which is very much all these machines at early stages of development, therefore essentially end up being something like a joint venture between sapling interests and the supplier. So with that discussion of what's being looked at, let's say, why are we looking at more nuclear? And I think this is quite an important point. Everyone says, well, COVID-19's knocked the living daylights out of the demand growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly the COVID-19 impact at the moment would mean that any discussion of what the assumption on load growth or otherwise in the IRP is very much changed by the COVID-19 crisis. We still don't know what the outcome is going to be. And it could well have a very large impact on the need for more power in the next few years, that's between now and 2030. But there's a very important point that says that the graph on the right-hand side you're looking at is a layer cake, each layer being a power station, each station being decommissioned at 50 years of life. And what you can see there is the decommissioning of ESCOM stations, and you can see 2030 and 2040. So in the next decade, not this decade so much, but the next decade, if we do not replace as a country the dispatchable baseload plant to support the industry in our current industrial economy, then we're going to have a significant challenge. People may argue that the answer is distributed generation and microgrids, but if that's the case, then why is heavy industry worrying about ESCOM's supply situation? So clearly that's putting that we need something coming into the system to replace those coal stations, which are clearly showing end of life with a vengeance. Their reliability performance figures are indicating that they are really running into quite simply end of life, and that's not including the need to upgrade them for environmental reasons. For those who know the ESCOM fleet, the idea of taking Komati and putting FGD on the back of Komati to make it more compliant is an almost economically insane idea. So what is SAF going to bring into the grid? And I'm not going to say who's going to do it, but something needs to replace the ESCOM baseload. You can see between 2030 and 2040, we lose something like 18,000 megawatts of power station that need replacing with something. What can we replace it with? Well, the dispatchable based options in the world at the moment that are being built as viable commercial activities, because the coal-fired stations, large hydroelectric, natural gas-fired combined cycle stations, and the nuclear power stations. Those are the options in the world today, and all the large grids in the world are basically, the backbone of the grid comes from one of those sources, or a combination of those sources. And given something like any exploitable hydro sources, and sources of current or current natural gas, coupled with the future constraints on carbon, it looks as though nuclear has to be part of the future. We haven't got hydro in the country. We can hydro over the border, massive, but it's a long way away and it's politically very challenging. Natural gas, we have the belief there's some offshore gas fields, but that belief has been there for some time. And natural gas, with a reasonable leakage rate on the pipeline of about 3%, which is what the US achieves, ends up having a climate change issue very similar to that of coal, if not worse. So let's just look at that, and then you must, well, can't we just ignore the carbon issue? And this is just an interesting graph that I just pop on the table, which says this is the world's carbon content electricity, and the one on the extreme right that is the worst on this graph is ourselves. Slightly worse than Poland. On the left-hand side, you can see the really good guys, and you've got the Norway's hydro, Sweden, which is hydro and nuclear, France that is nuclear, New Zealand, which is hydro, Brazil's hydro and a bit nuclear, Canada's hydro and nuclear. So you can sort of get a feeling which says which end of the world, and if that's a constraint on the world, then we've got to be thinking about putting something in the grid. So just to cut this off, the present view is that we've got COVID-19 will knock the living daylights out of demand for the next couple of years. That's understood. But even if we take into account, we have to start replacing ESCOM's coal fleet with something else. and I'll come back to something else and so on. People may also say, well, yeah, but we don't need to be exactly matching everything. We don't need dispatchable base load. We can live with a bit of intermittency, and just a little bit of load loss is not going to hurt us. And I'll just put up Eskom's load shedding history, which is always interesting to put up. Everyone talks about load shedding in this country as being an absolute nightmare. It has been. That is the period, the 2007, 2008 figures, and then 2014 and 15, and then the stop and the recurrence in 2018, 2019. And in 2020 to date, that's clearly been stopped by the COVID crisis. What is really fascinating in this graph is that is gigawatt hours shed. As you can see, we peak out at 1352 gigawatt hours, which happens to be about 0.61, less than 0.6% of the annual supply of electricity. Eskom has never shed more than 1% of supply in any year, and yet the damage we've had done. So anyone talking about not having consistent energy supply, industry will not grow in a society without such as energy supply. So I think the point is we've got to put something dispatchable and baseload in the system to support the grid, because the rounding errors, 0.61 is a rounding error, but it isn't a rounding error in the national economy. Okay, so what programs could we see coming out of the RFI, given that background, given what the RFI says? First thing is that I believe it indicates that conventional PWRs are being considered for coastal plants. They mentioned 2 sites, and the logic would be, the best logic might be to put 2 more units at Koeberg with a large-scale desalination. What's also interesting is that just the background is that when Koeberg was commissioned in 84, 85, it supplied virtually the entire Western Cape power at peak. Western Cape power has more than doubled since then. So in terms of keeping up with the demand when Koeberg was built, then the idea of 2 more units in the Cape area, that could be the Eastern Cape or could be at Koeberg, makes sense. Desalination would make sense to support the Western. So my assumption is that that is what that's looking for, is 2, let's say 1100 megawatt type class machines to go with the Koeberg machines. That will be 1100 megawatts when they've been uprated, which would give it a very more credible and secure supply in the Western Cape. That looks like half of it. The other part, SMR project, I believe is being seen as a development program to place some of Eskom's key coal stations in Mpumalanga as they decommission. Now, there's a very important socio-economic issue here, and I'm going to be accused by somebody of being a bit harsh, but Mpumalanga's economy consists of doing really 3 things. They dig coal out the ground, they burn the coal on the biggest collection of coal stations in the world probably, and they grow mealies. If we don't replace the coal stations with some other industrial activity of a similar scale and size, then we're going to be essentially condemning the province of Mpumalanga to being almost an economic wasteland in 10, 15 years' time. So there's a socio-economic between. What's also worth bearing in mind is that if we are going into Mpumalanga with such stations, they could be expected to use dry cooling technology to limit their water consumption. But what's really exciting about that is if we was going to go to put SMRs on the current Eskom sites, and that's the ones Eskom's declared to be the first ones to be going off the grid is Komati, Kutfe, and Camden, with machines that are SMRs at, let's say, 1 to 200 megawatts electrical. That would link back in with the Eskom system, which currently has 200 megawatt unit size machines on those sites, with Komati being 100 megawatt plus machines. But also it would then make a machine that would fit very well into the African continent north of us. So the smaller grid systems north of sub-Saharan Africa cannot support machines of much more than about 200 megawatts because the grids are too small for anything bigger than that. So if South Africa was to roll out SMRs, the beginning of an SMR project in the Highveld, then it would actually lead potentially to a very interesting discussion of rolling out nuclear in countries north of us in Africa, who actually have a need to get low carbon, low cost energy, but can't afford large machines, can't accommodate large machines, even if they can afford them. So what are the timescales we're looking at in this discussion? RFI was issued 14th of January. The acknowledgement is requested by the 15th of July. That means you say, I think I'll be answering this, with the document submission on the 15th of September. Those dates are all known. They're in the RFI document. The logical dates to go with that is that the RFP could be issued presumably in 2021, given that the documents were received by DMRE, whatever reviews done of them, generate an IRP sometime in 2021. And this links in quite well with the Minister of Minerals and Energy, Koeberg, in his budget speech said that he intends to finalize the contracts for the nuclear program by 2024. He also mentioned he wanted to get the fire reactor replacement finalized by 2024 contractually, and the interim store, the centralized interim store at Valputs. But the important thing is 2024. If 2024 is a date, it would certainly be credible based on an RFP issued in 2021, that could conceivably lead to the first of the SMR lead unit start commissioning in 2030. No, they didn't say commercial because it'll be, in a sense, close to a first of a class, but it certainly could be physically complete by about 2030. And in parallel with that, Unit 1 PWR could be commercial operation 2032, which would be 8 years after contract's finalization, which is very much aligned to the contracts that were initially drawn up for Nuclear 1 by ESCOM in 2006, like 2007-8 with those vendors. It's in line with the Belarus project. It's in line with most of the projects in the world, and in fact with the Koeberg project, that it's about 8 years from inking the contract to commercial operation in the contract. So with that lot, I've got a couple more slides. Economic impact. I think it's worth bearing in mind that if you do the existing studies, and there were 2 studies here, which is the assessment of Koeberg Power Station by KPMG in 2017, and the Nuclear 1 EIA economic impact study, what you see is that if you were to build on the Koeberg site 2 by 1100 megawatt PWRs, you would end up with something like 61,000 jobs created during construction for 7 years, and the societal implied about 36,000 jobs for 20 years. I put 20 years there just because one can put in the 60-year life of a nuclear plant, but it would end up with somewhat unusual. So in terms of job years numbers, for the investment in today's money of about $10–12 billion, I would hate to quote those around as exchange rate keeps changing, you're looking at potentially something like 1.2 million job years, a significant impact on the economy. But then comes the question of what is the key driver, and the key driver of any of these projects is always financial. Financial is a resource discussion, and this is the graph which in fact is very similar to one ESCOM used in its annual report last year. This is the world electricity prices according to the World Electricity Council in US dollars per kilowatt in 2018. And what you can see is it ranges from 33 cents in Germany down to 8 cents in China, and that's where South Africa sits. So we're down with the India, China, Indonesia, Canada, South Korea, Brazil. And so that's the pricing structure we have to aim to get. Any RFI that is going to support us, the RFI has to provide information that supports us going forward into the next phase of an RFP. That's to indicate there is a way in which we can get down to the price of power. And this is the sale price, not the grid price, being in those levels. Clearly, a solution that might work in Germany or Belgium at 30 cents, or Italy or Portugal or Spain, wouldn't necessarily work in this country. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and pass you back to Pat. I hope that's been interesting. And I've left Pat 10 minutes for the questions. So Pat, back to you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you to our presenters, to both Dave and Simon. Colleagues, we've come to the end, and it's question time. We've noted questions that have been posted. We will record and respond to all those that have been posted, but we do have time on hand. We've done well in terms of our presentation. Can we take some questions from the audience? All right, I don't see no one's responding. Let me share with you some of the questions that we've got on the dashboard. Sorry, there's
Can I
someone there.
Can I just assist there? It's Tebile Prof. I see
Please
there
come
are
in.
a couple of questions. Yes, there are a couple of questions from Bev Lawrence. Should I go ahead and read the questions?
Please do. Please do.
The first question is, the Greenies oppose this project. How do they propose replacing it with a 2,500 megawatts baseload with RE? That's the first question. The second question is, why are the very successful submarine reactors not implemented for land-based small nuclear power stations? I don't know if you want to respond to those two.
I can try and answer those two. The second one is particularly interesting, as I started my career on nuclear submarines. In terms of Greenies opposing it, I'm always intrigued by the Greenies. You use the word Greenie, I want to be careful by the climate change lobbyists, because it's interesting that they always come up and say, the issue is climate change and the solution is renewable, which jumps the statement saying the issue is climate change, therefore the issue is reducing CO2, climate change gas emissions from the system, and therefore the solutions are ones that reduce that emission standard. And I think I very strongly said that there are two logical reasons why people oppose large scale, be it large hydro or be it nuclear, proven low carbon technologies, both of which have been proven for the last 50, 60 years. And the answer, there's two answers that I see to this. And one answer is very simple. It says that there is an ideological belief of moving us back to a, quote, simpler life, where we are more connected to nature, which sounds really good until you realize what it means is going back to the 17th century, where you get up with the sun and you go to bed with the sun, and you mill your corn when the wind is blowing. So I don't think there's any serious proposal to replace nuclear, to replace baseload with renewables. That view is changing technology. The other lobby is that of the businessmen who recognize that if you want to do a large project, like let us say Grandinga, or let us say another nuclear plant like Koeberg, then it will be a state-run project with state financing. And that means there is nowhere for the middleman to make his few percent markup. So big projects are run by governments, the risks are taken by governments, and the financing is extremely competitive rates. So you've got these two teams. People forget about what greenhouse effect of methane, which is 84 times worse than Tier 2. In terms of submarine reactors, I'll answer it very simply. I used to run a nuclear submarine. I never heard the word costs being mentioned in the nuclear submarine in my time on submarines. That was not important. We had no safety systems, in the sense that the argument was we had high quality materials, and if there was a massive failure, the official line was we were expendable as long as the great British public wasn't hurt by it. So there is move to put some submarine reactor type technology into these SMRs, but the small PWRs built for submarines are not really geared up for the low-cost operation for land-based operations. So I don't think it's true. The one place it has been used that they have put submarine type reactors is the Russians have built a floating reactor. Now the Russians have built reactors for their icebreakers for the last 30, 40 years. They put two of these into a barge. They've made them have an electric generator, and they've moved them up to a place near Bilyvino, which is in the far east of Russia. It's very close to Alaska. It's way north of the Arctic Circle, and it's an industrial center in mining, but that isn't competing with the grid. That is just saying it's cheaper to put a nuclear power station there than to put diesel fuel. So to answer the second question is, submarine reactors are wonderful, very flexible. They're not lined up to be highly competitive machines. The technology certainly can be applied to SMRs, but to be different design. And the first one is, yeah, the Greenies oppose it because they don't really believe in getting rid of greenhouse gases. Because they did, they'll be supporting large hydro and nuclear as their two biggest choices. Sorry, back to you for questions.
Thank you, Dave. Can I take two more questions? The first one is, how successful are the new nuclear stations operating? I guess they're referring to the existing stations. And the second question goes, I believe Fukushima failed because of the tsunami protection wall built was not high enough, allowing the basement to flood, knocking out the emergency generators and reactors coolant pumps. If they were situated on a higher level like the turbine operating floor, this would have been avoided. What is the status at Koeberg?
Okay. In terms of new nuclear stations, I must say that with one exception in the last 30 years, and I'll quote that in a second, one of the things about nuclear power is that you are really depressingly rigorous on all your getting everything right before you start up. So when Koeberg was first commissioned in '84, the assumption in National Control Center was that it would operate like any other first of a class plant. The first unit, and we now see it with Medupi and Kasili, but you also saw it with Kendall and previous stations. When you first bring online the first machine of a 6-pack, your first year or so is a disaster. You have masses of trips because you haven't set it up properly. And what completely shocked National Control was 1,000 megawatt came on at Koeberg for Unit 1, and it stayed there. But it stayed there for a year. And the real example of the nuclear industry is that nuclear power stations, and this is not controversial, when you first start a nuclear station up, it comes on stream. Once you've commissioned it and got to full power, it stays there and it's quite very reliable. It's interesting to note that Koeberg 2, I believe, was the fastest in the French fleet. It took 44 days from loading fuel to full power. When he got to full power, it stayed there for a year. The one station, I mentioned there was one station, there was one Japanese station, nuclear station, which started up and had a bit of a catastrophe and then had a long wait to restart properly. And that was because its low pressure turbine disc on its steam turbine failed and disintegrated, which clearly was a bit of a disaster. But it wasn't a nuclear problem, it was a turbine problem. But generally, the experience of nuclear power stations is extremely good. You can see the same now with the Chinese are saying that the performance of Taishan 1 and 2, which are the new EPRs, and the performance of Sanmen 1 and 2 and Haiyang 1 and 2, which are the AP1000s in China, have both been extremely good for the first year, very reliable, and there's no history of nuclear plants having a sort of burn-in phase like we're having now with Medupi Kasili, largely because the engineering is much more done up front and much less done. In terms of Fukushima and Koeberg, I always get amused that when Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1, that's the first station, was contracted for, and it started up in '76. It started up the same year that Koeberg was ordered. It had a seismic design load of about half of Koeberg's, was being specified at the same time, and its tsunami design basis for Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 was 1.7 meters and Koeberg was 7 meters. And in fact, even when the event occurred, the Koeberg tsunami design base was still 7 meters design base, and the figure at Fukushima Daiichi was 5.7 meters. So even though they're on the ring of fire, everybody had been telling the Japanese for some years that their tsunami and their earthquake was not quite where it should be, particularly tsunami. So the answer to that question at one level is yes, Koeberg has got much better defense against tsunami. So if Koeberg had been sitting where Fukushima Daiichi was when the event happened, it would not have been as severe an event by any means as far as we are concerned, or I'm concerned. I think one of the key differences between modern SMRs and large reactors like Koeberg is that, and even the other more passenger Gen 3 machines, is the older reactors, or so-called Gen 2 reactors, made the point that their active safety systems would keep them safe. So in other words, when something happened, your diesel started, your pump started, and you pushed water into the core to keep the thing flooded and keep it cool. Which means that if your support systems are damaged by some external event, be that a tsunami, an aircraft crash, a fire, choose your thing, then you are threatening the main reactor. So what happened in Fukushima Daiichi? The tsunami did not hurt the nuclear systems, it hurt their support structures in terms of their diesels and their switchboards. Generation 3 reactors are much less concerned about that, not perfect, but virtually all the small modular reactors are designed with essentially no external safety systems. So if you just turn all the outside systems off and take them away, the central part of the reactor will stay cool, which leads to a lower power density in many cases, but in fact a walkaway safety. And the classic example that would be the PWR, where the design base accident of PWR was just, we couldn't make a design base, we couldn't generate an accident which failed the fuel. It was, you could fail everything and it didn't hurt the fuel. So that's sort of the Fukushima discussion. But certainly for Koeberg at the moment, Koeberg, the tsunami height at which Koeberg is really into trouble is probably around 14 meters. And at 14 meters, that's a real problem to Koeberg when it really isn't at that point. But I'll point out the Cape Flats is then underwater. You've got 1 million people swimming in False Bay, which is not going to be a good health effect either. So thank you. That's those two questions answered as best I can.
Thank you, Dave. Prof, how are we doing in terms of time? Are we allowed to take more questions or should we close?
No, please continue. We've got time and there's quite a few more questions and they're all very exciting. So please continue.
Okay, thanks. I will take 2 more questions. The next question is from Frederick Verdol. It says, is the SMR in commercial operating worldwide? And then it says, what is the status of the technology and cost compared to the PWR? The next question is, what extended industries will be developed due to the nuclear program? That is from OPA.
Okay, let me just start with the first one. SMRs, in one sense, you can argue if you define SMRs as reactors below 300 megawatts, Koeberg's 1,000. Classically, there is hardly a commercial machine on the market less than 1,200 megawatts nowadays. So SMRs are 300 and less. As of today, I would argue there are 4 SMR plants that can claim SMRs and built, if that makes sense. And I'll start with the easy one, which is the oldest one, which is that the Indians, using heavy water reactors based on heavy water reactors, have a series of reactors of 220 megawatts each, I believe. Quite a few of them. They're now building a 540 megawatt version and they're going up in size. So in theory, the Indians could argue that they've got a small modular reactor in the size class of sub 300 megawatts. However, that really is very much I'd say a Gen 2 machine. It certainly wasn't developed in the modern sense of being passive safety and everything else. However, you ask cost questions, that was the question you're asking there. The current cost that they are claiming for their domestic projects for the 540 megawatt reactor, this is the ones that they're building now, is coming in at about $2,500 a kilowatt. So if you take that as a reference point, the Indians in India believe that they're coming at about $2,500 a kilowatt, which quite bluntly would be very competitive. It's about the same price per kilowatt. It's not far from the same price per kilowatt as say, steel is costing. Given the 3 other designs which are seen to be SMRs in the more modern sense of the word, as I said, the Russians have built a floating reactor which they've taken off the northern Siberian coast. I don't know the economics of those plants. I suspect they're not that cheap, but the problem is they're not comparing with classical grid power. They're comparing with essentially a diesel generator and get diesel fuel north of the Arctic Circle in large amounts. So it's commercially viable, but in a niche. The other one's in construction is a water-cooled reactor called the Karim 25, and that one is being built in Argentina. It is an integral water-cooled reactor, very much like the American NuScale and other one type designs. It's a 25 megawatt electric machine, and I think the commercial machine is meant to be over 100 megawatts, so it isn't a full-size machine. And I'll be honest about it, I suspect that the Argentinian economy is giving them real challenges to complete that off. So that's being done, but it's being done in an environment where the support and the funding options are very, very limited. Probably the most exciting one, certainly from a South African point of view, is the Chinese. The Chinese have a program which was very similar to the PWR project. They have essentially completed their first unit in Shandong. It's called the HTRPM. And it basically is a pebble bed reactor like the PWR was, but with two reactors linked together, making steam, driving a steam turbine. It's a 210 megawatt electrical machine. They have essentially completed the first setup. They should be commissioning it later this year into next year. It is all plugged together. So it's the first one that actually, and it is one of a design that's intended to be a commercial rollout to replace coal stations, possibly in China. It's quite exciting because it's steam conditions of 570 degrees centigrade. So it's very much similar in steam conditions to a Koeberg, to a Medupi or a Kasili. Their costing, they state, is that the first unit has cost them around $1 billion, which would be, if you believe those numbers, and I'm not going to comment on them, would be about $5,000 a kilowatt, which is about the export price of LWRs. And they believe they will get, in serious production, they believe they'll get down to well below $3,000 a kilowatt, which will be desperately competitive. Everybody else is talking of studies, so I don't be careful with it. So in terms of the SMR costing, the indications are, and certainly we have the same information with PWR being developed, is that if you can get into a serious construction, in other words, let's say 10, 15, 20 machines in being built, then you start getting costs down that are very competitive. That's the theory, and the Chinese are closest to proving that. In terms of industrial development, that was the second question. I think that you must understand that the answer will be a complete range. If we look at building another Koeberg type reactor, in other words, you literally take the off-the-shelf machine that we're talking about for the PWRs potentially, then you're going to end up with not heavy industry, because that's going to be, there's not enough manufacturing in one or two or even three units to justify that. But you would see a lot of associated engineering, so civil works clearly massively. But also I think in that area, you get some things like you're going to end up with a whole pile of, like you've had in the area around Medupi and Kasili, a whole pile of industrial development of light industry supporting the overall build program. I think if we go for the SMR option, then clearly there is no production line building SMRs in the world today. What essentially South Africa is bringing to the table here is the prospect of saying, if you come and join with us and we'll do an African reactor, then we have a joint venture possibly, potentially with the overseas OEM or the original OEM. In that case, you could be looking at quite a range of engineering and manufacturing skills to go with it. Theoretically, again, with the PWR project, which is a good reference, we estimated we get over 80% local content reasonably soon in the project on machine 10 or so. But it is a massive industrial opportunity. I said earlier that the key thing in this one is we've got to plan for success as a country. I'm always amused by guys who say we shouldn't plan for success, it's too risky, because I know if you plan for failure, I guarantee you'll achieve it. Thank you. Back to you, Sabili.
Thank you, Dave. I'll take two more questions. The next question is from Davis. He's asking, it says, how does David see the small modular reactor program roll out from design to implementation? Secondly, your views on the essential nature of intrinsic safety and safeguards. The next one,
Perfect.
says there's been some talk of new nuclear reactors that reuse nuclear waste and produce less waste. Is there anything in the RFI dealing with this?
Okay. On the first question, my view of the rollout, I'll be honest, and this is a very personal view. My view is the logic is that we need to localize this as far as possible. Said one advantage of the SMR is that there is no production facility in the world building mass producing SMRs. Therefore, we can create that infrastructure potentially here, and the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is absolutely the place where small modular reactors make the most sense. And in fact, the second question, body question, comes to that as well. So my view at the moment is if someone gave me a blank check, which unfortunately no one ever gives you, and we got a partner who was prepared to get involved in this, I would look at the prospect of looking at building and the reference machine for South Africa would be basically the same as the machine they're building overseas if they're building one, Pelindaba, Nexus facility. And the reason for that is because that then provides the engineering hub and the training center for the rest of the fleet. And then basically one would aim to replace the current coal stations on the current sites on a one-for-one basis with as they get decommissioned. So you go to Komati, you'd shut Komati down, you'd flatten the whole station completely. On the same site, you would build 1,000 megawatts of SMRs. Then you would go to Camden and Krutvlei and Hendrina and so on, and you would build a production line essentially in South Africa doing that. That's my rollout view. And then I think if you did that and the costing was sensible, you'd end up with the African rollout being also vital, because you go to any African state and you'll find they've got really two sources of energy normally. One is a hydro scheme, which is very low cost and very competitive. That's in Tanzania, for example, it's 6 cents, which is very reasonable. But the alternative is burning diesel generators. So expansion in Africa needs an energy source which is low cost, does not require a large grid because there isn't a large grid in Africa, and it meets modern environmental standards. And that comes to your next question, which is that to do this, you've got to have a couple of things. You've got to have a completely standardized machine. You don't re-engineer it for every project. You like buying motor cars, you go to the garage, you don't say, I'd like a BMW 525, but can I please have a 3-liter engine, not a 3.2-liter engine? You don't have that discussion. They offer you 3 designs. Secondly, we would need as Africa very much to get a standardized licensing process. So the regulations were common and the regulations came as part of the package. Again, like when you buy your motor car, nobody conceivably asks you when you buy your Toyota Corolla, no one says you must now go out and do the crash testing to prove this design is good. The assumption is that Toyota Corolla has Toyota's built a standardized machine that meets the standards. And to go with that then comes the requirement that you don't want to have the safety requirements that go with something like Koeberg, where you've got active systems and testing. You want to make a machine which essentially has passive safety features, so the operators really, whatever they do, cannot actually cause nuclear damage. They may write off the power station, but they can't cause nuclear damage. That's quite in place. And with that also goes, absolutely vital, is a simplified and trustworthy proliferation control of how you do the fuel handling to make sure you don't have concern about rolling out reactors into Africa, and then you've got people worrying about nuclear proliferation from that. So that's, can I ask Mr. Davis's questions? The reusing of nuclear waste, yes, there are many designs out there which the physicists love, which look at the prospect of putting waste into a reactor to change its atomic structure. Very credible, very reasonable, but they're not yet being seen as a commercial process at the moment. So I don't think they're on the table. Clearly, management of the fuel cycle is important, but essentially what the simplest we can get away with. So I don't think at the moment, certainly it doesn't have a negative comment about them, but I'd be surprised if somebody comes up and says, this is a small modular reactor which will use Koeberg's waste fuel to make more energy. The economics don't seem to make sense on that at the moment. May do in years to come. Thank you. Back to you, somebody.
Thank you, Dave. I'd like to note that there's quite a number of questions coming through, so we're definitely not going to be able to go through all of them at this stage in the interest of time. However, I would like to inform all attending members that we will get to all the questions and post the answers either on our website or on the YouTube channel, so stay tuned. We will do that. So I'll take last two questions and then hand over to Prof. Naidoo to wrap up. So my next question is, what is the prospect of nuclear forming part of the energy mix? That's one. Number two, there is negative perception about nuclear in South Africa, and I think the reason is lack of information. Don't you think it is time people like you, like yourselves, should start going public about nuclear instead of only politicians and officials? Those are the two last questions. Over to you, Dave.
Okay. I have a big rumor that nuclear already forms part of our energy mix, and if you happen to live in Cape Town, you've been dependent on nuclear energy for the last 30 years. I think the prospect of you're saying is, what's the prospect of nuclear being in the future energy mix? And my view is, I come back to a very simple argument. What's the alternative? If we accept that the present coal fleet cannot go on as it is now, you either go to renewables, which have not commercially worked anywhere in the world without subsidies. And so looking at that chart I put up of the cost of energy, you will load the ones to the right-hand side, the low-cost people tend to be the people looking heavily at nuclear and coal and gas. People to the right are people looking at renewables, the expensive ones looking at renewables. So my answer is, what's the alternative? There is no alternative at the moment at this stage. In this country, we've got plenty of coal. We could burn coal extensively, but there are political problems on that. And even though we are a very small emitter, we're going to be in political pressure massively to reduce our carbon emissions. Natural gas is at the moment imported, and even if we had natural gas, it would be a avoidable cost issue. But natural gas. So I think the prospect nuclear energy mix, I think, is very good. I think it actually is interesting how it survived the transition politically with President Ramaphosa taking over. Everyone said that was the end of it because the last one was purely Mr. President Zuma's view, and nobody else supported it. But they forget that Eskom started the commercial nuclear program process in 2006-07, and that was under Mr. President Mbeki. So all three presidents have at different times been supporting a nuclear solution. So it is not as simple as saying it doesn't work. I'd like to get the public comment. This is a very important one. One of the problems that, and I'll speak now as a retired gentleman, is that if you're working for a large state corporation and you want to lobby for a technology which against, let's say, members of the government elsewhere, it's very difficult to do it. When I was Eskom's chief nuclear officer, you had to be careful what you said, because comments like, well, the death toll from coal stations dwarfs that of nuclear stations, and in fact, renewables are more expensive and less safe, did not get you any marks in the company. So you've got a position where people working essentially in the public service have to follow public policy at a high level. That's the problem you've got. If you go onto a talk show on renewables versus nuclear, to use a classical discussion, you will find that the renewable people are almost universally, industrially and personally, commercially involved in making money from renewables. On the nuclear side, if you have the opposite team turning up from, at the moment, let's say, the Chinese, the Koreans, and the Russians, it will get you nowhere. It's a psychology discussion which says it's okay for somebody from Denmark or Germany to come here and become a policymaker on how we should do renewables when they are essentially ending up being part of the renewable lobby group, whereas the alternative of somebody coming, let's say, from Russia and becoming a policymaker for nuclear would be seen as unacceptable. So I don't know quite how we handle that one. But at the moment, the problem is that the lobby groups for nuclear, because of its nature, tend to be academic at high level in in state organizations, and therefore politics is very difficult. So it's quite nice being a retired gentleman, so I can say things that are a bit more drastic than I would have said if I was in ESCOM. Thank you. Back to you, Sibylla.
Thank you, Dave, for that. I think it's time now to take it back to Prof. Naidoo to wrap up. Thank you. Back to you, Pat.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, actually, I see there's a lot of hands that are coming up and there's a lot of energy in the room. I note we still have time on hand, and I note that the audience is still with us. So folks are not leaving and going away. They are staying with us. So maybe I'll just continue with one or two more questions. And they're very encouraging questions. So maybe I'll just continue and then I'll wrap up thereafter. Dave and Simon, there's one from my colleagues at City of Johannesburg, and he says that cities with financial capacity have been encouraged to pursue investments, and this is the encouragement has come from President Ramaphosa. What is the prospect of nuclear forming part of the city's energy mix? Dave and Simon, for your consideration.
I'll take that one. Let me just say a bit of history. I apologize for going back to history. If you think of the town power stations, if we go back to when City Power was first created, whatever it was called in those days, back in the 20s and 30s, you had a town power station which supplied the town. The one we can see, in fact, it's quite funny, from Megawatt Park, you can only see one power station, and that's Kelvin, which ESCOM doesn't own. Your Kelvin power station, classical town power station. The logic, assuming you get the economics right of small modular reactors, assuming you get the safety arguments all put to bed, and those are pretty big assumptions, then the logic actually of putting small modular reactors as city power stations again is actually very credible. And I will comment that so therefore the answer to that question is yes. Next question. The idea of building a power station, let's literally take Kelvin. The idea of, I've mentioned earlier on the ESCOM stations because they're the ones that are, but the idea of taking Kelvin down and putting 600 megawatts, let's say 3 or 4 small modular reactors on Kelvin site to feed into the grid is very good. And the nice thing is that unlike the present Kelvin, you aren't trying to bring in X thousand tons of coal a day to keep it going. So yeah. And it will also provide power reliably at evening peak, which PV isn't going to help you with much. So in terms of investment, yes, it's mainly politics and acceptability that's the issue. It's not technology per se.
David, there's one for you from Des Muller. Why wait till 2024 to finalize the PWR contract when you have demonstrated we will be in serious trouble with energy security? Urgency seems to be ignored. Okay, comments on that?
Comment on that is very simple. I mean, I always love people who have large projects that have 10, 12-year horizons with critical end dates, and then assume that because it's such a long schedule, you can always move it back by a year and you haven't lost anything. The answer to that question is that it's a practical limit. Let's talk a schedule through. First of all, 2024 came from the minister's statement. He wants this in place by 2024. So assuming we go forward on the PWR front with the RFI, well, the RFI comes results. We get the results in September. The government sits down with the relevant stakeholders in the industry, talks about it, and puts out a request for proposal. Let's say if we're first quarter 2021. That's as fast as one can do it. One's got National Treasury on board, everyone understands what's going on, and Cabinet. It would then realistically take 18 months, because you're then going to open tender. You cannot say, I have chosen my friend Fred. I happen to like the Americans, and therefore we'll deal with the Americans, we'll only deal with Americans. It will almost certainly have to be an open tender, although it has clearly constraints. You then negotiate and come with a preferred vendor out of those vendors, and then finalize the details with that vendor. That is going to take you realistically probably until, at the very best, middle 22, late 22. Then you're going to get the approvals to get done. So maybe with 2023 is the target date for signing a contract, but that's the kind of time period you're realistically in with. Given we've got to go through a whole pile of very appropriate governance control processes to get there. So that answer, that I think is an answer to the question. Of course, if we had placed the contract in 2008, as was planned for the Nuclear One program, we would have the first machines online realistically by about 2018. So it could be argued that the plans of the early 2020, this is 2025, 26, 27, which talked of a major rollout of nuclear at that point, 20,000 megawatts by 2025, would have avoided the crisis we hit in 2017 with no power. But that's history. If you give me a time machine, I can change the world.
Thank you. There's one from Davies. I know he's raised his hand, but I can't bring him in. And Davies wants to know, David, how do you see the small modular reactor program rollout from design to implementation, and your views on the intrinsic safety versus safeguards regarding small modular reactor?
I did that question about 5 minutes ago. You're repeating a previous question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go to one from Koeberg van Zyl. With the increase of nuclear power production, we will see an increase in waste production. What technologies are we looking into regarding waste management or repurposing nuclear projects? And then your comments on Hinkley Point C run over budget. Is there a way against mitigating against these in time and cost?
Okay, I'll start with the first one, and I'm now going back into history. Disposal of nuclear fuel is very straightforward. It's already been licensed for operation in Finland, and I think Sweden as well. They're building their final repositories. But the problem you've got with disposing of nuclear waste, so we're talking about spent fuel, I presume we're talking here, is economics, and not the economics you expect. Eskom has a significant provision for the disposal of Koeberg spent fuel. Now, what's really interesting about spent fuel, about disposing of a nuclear fuel assembly, is that the nuclear fuel assembly, the cost of disposing of it is in part linked to the decay heat generated by the spent fuel element. You've got to space out your spent fuel so the rock can absorb the heat. And so the older the fuel is, the cheaper it is to dispose of. So you've now got three costs sitting and staring in the face with spent fuel disposal: the cost of storage, the cost of disposal, and the cost and the budget you've got aside for it. So let's say the budget first of all. You put money in a piggy bank, and it's growing. It's being invested like any pension fund. It's making money. It's growing at, let's say, 3, 4, 5% a year in real terms. You've got the cost of disposal, which every year gets less. And lastly, you've got the cost of storing it, which essentially is very small indeed. If in South African sense, we'd have it in spent fuel casks sitting up in foul puts on a concrete pad, and the little man making sure that no one stole any of them. So the problem you've got is the business case doesn't exist for disposing of spent fuel, because every year the costs go down and the amount of money available goes up. So the problem with spent fuel disposal is there are many technologies, but the cheapest one is to store it essentially ad infinitum and have the money for this final disposal. But if you want to dispose of it, bury it in the ground. That's a done deal. You can reprocess it, but it's expensive and no one's got a commercial case. Might make sense as the price of uranium goes through the roof. Hinkley Point C is fascinating. Hinkley Point C is a result of a commercial process. Hinkley Point C's costs are much higher than anyone likes. And in fact, their PPA is £92.50 per megawatt hour, which is an insane amount of money for nuclear power. The reason it's 92.5 per megawatt hour is because when they started negotiation, when EDF started negotiation with the British government on building a nuclear plant, they looked at their competition. And at that point, the UK contract for differences, which is their equivalent for PPA, for onshore wind, which was the cheapest bulk alternative, although it clearly wasn't dispatchable, was £95 a megawatt hour. So what Hinkley Point C did was they said, we will bid in at £2.50 less than our competitor. Classical process. And the problem they had was when they did that, then all their suppliers said, aha, there is lots of money in this project. So all the cost of Hinkley Point C went through the roof, in my view, because they hadn't got any cost control, because their basic figure was that the sale price was too high. What is most interesting was I was on a webinar last week talking about, they're talking among other things about the cost of Sizewell C, which is an exact cut and paste of Hinkley Point C. And what's interesting, they've already seen massive learning between Hinkley Point C Unit 1 and Hinkley Point C Unit 2. They've seen and they're arguing that the cost at Sizewell C for the same PPA would be back between £40 and £60 a megawatt hour. And so that's the answer there. But the real problem at Hinkley Point C has been the fact that if you tell me that I'm going to, if someone says, I will pay you X, then all your suppliers know it, then what's happened to you is your price has gone up, and all the suppliers. And a silly example of that I'll give you is apparently the reference machine Flamanville has its fire protection designed to French standards. Quite reasonable, quite decent. The safety authorities demanded that they re-engineer the entire Hinkley Point C to meet slightly different UK standards, which meant room size had to change slightly. It would have been arguable that they could have made an exception because it's very reasonable French safety requirements. But if there's so much money in the project, why don't you get it done the way you want it? And that's sort of the problem they've hit with Hinkley Point C. It is by far the most expensive plant in the world today. What you can see across the world is those plants being run as one-offs in the first world, and I use that as a USA, are very expensive. Those that are standardized and being done by what are current serial builders, that's the Chinese, the Russians, the Koreans, and the Indians, are coming in at about half the price or less of the supposed first world costs, with the same safety standards and the same manufacturing plants being used for large components. That was that question. Yes. So
and I see you're enjoying it, so maybe I'll give you the next two also. How come South Africa does not continue with the PBMR program, and how far is Rolls-Royce with their design and construction of their SMR in the UK?
PBMR, in my humble opinion, and as the audience may know, I was the program director of that essentially from 93 till 2004. If you're going to build engineering, there were no great issues on PBMR. There was no the design that existed in 2003, which was ready for almost going to the field. None of the assumptions that were made in that design in terms of fuel performance were actually proven incorrect. And that was highly competitive. The problem was, and I'll put politics in this one, Eskom had no interest in building new power stations. Do not forget, up until 2004, 2005. Eskom was told in 98 that it would not build any more power stations of any kind. And Eskom's whole internal structure therefore ended up with no desire to move any new build project forward of any kind. And it was only in 2004 when Alec Irwin took over Public Enterprises and said, who is building power plants to meet our 2007 predicted crisis, that Eskom say, we're not building anything, we've been told not to. So in that context, Eskom did not see a point doing a research development project. Eskom then essentially withdrew from the project as a prime sponsor in 2004, and it was taken over by the government. And while the government funded it from 2004 to 2010, without a launch customer who was committed to make the project work, it is very difficult to make a project go forward. And people do not invest in projects where the launch customers walked away by body language. They may say the right things. So that's what killed the PWR. But I will comment that in very many ways, what the Chinese have done at Shandong is quite close to the PWR concepts, and no one's debating the economics that PWR has put forward. It may be certainly it would be highly competitive in today's era, but that was one. In terms of the Rolls-Royce work, and here I'm going to say that there's somebody told me recently there's 140 SMR projects in the world today, and so people are designing, and you really cannot tell from what's in the public domain whether that design is down to the manufacturing level, which is the last thing which PWR got to. In other words, they're physically making components, or whether it's still at the what we used to call the cartoon stage. Nothing wrong with the cartoon, but you doodle it up and you say that's a nice design. Let's check what the materials and temperatures will be. So I don't know where Rolls-Royce is in that process. It'll clearly be I suspect, a water-cooled reactor. And I have a bit of a challenge with water-cooled reactors because the pressure vessel costs tend to be an issue on a water-cooled reactor, which is passive. But that's just a view. But I don't know where Rolls-Royce is as such. What is maybe interesting is that apparently there were South African people, ex-PWR, in about half the SMR projects in the world. Back to you, Pat.
Thank you. No, thank you. And while we're still there in the UK, as a Scottish colleague wants to know about the decommissioning of the reactors in Scotland. If you could comment on the Hunterson and Torness decommissioning in Scotland, if you have any information on that.
I have almost no information on that. And I mean, the only problem is that I'll give you an example of the problem with the AGRs. And it's very simple. The graphite has a limited life, and the design of the reactor gives you, I think, a 7-inch hole to get into the core structure. It's a graphite life issue, but I know little more than that. I know the Scottish very much want to go to an all renewable field, which is great. They hate the Scottish government hates nuclear. So when they've got no nuclear stations left and they've closed the border, I'm not sure how they're going to run their grid, but that's their problem. But I can't speak about Scottish power stations, I'm afraid.
No, that's fair enough. No, thank you for that, Dave. I think, colleagues, let's start to wrap up at this point. There's still lots more questions coming in, and we'll post them all onto the Institute website, and we'll have them answered, not just by Dave, but by the team itself, and we'll be able to give you some feedback. In terms of wrapping up, I think it's come out very clearly that the positioning of the workings of the chapter is very much along the path of contributing to the energy mix of South Africa, nuclear seen as just only one part of that energy mix. There's certainly the other opportunities as demonstrated in the IRP2019 issue. And again, it's for all of us to collectively come together and see how best we could make that contribution in terms of South Africa's energy security. When we look at the triple bottom line of the country, that of unemployment, poverty and inequality, there's certainly opportunity in terms of work for the next decade. We've heard of the opportunities in the Cape. We've heard about the opportunities in the Mpumalanga province, and we've also heard of the opportunities at Nexus with respect to the medical radioisotope faculty and facility. So there's a lot of work for us all to collectively do in terms of helping to grow South Africa's economic prosperity and also our own individual careers going forward. Let me take this opportunity of saying thank you to all our attendees for your participation today. and we look forward to your support and assistance as we start to roll out the workings of the chapter. So on that note, let me say thank you, and thank you to our presenters, and thank you to all our attendees. I will then take my leave now. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and do keep an eye on our social media